1,000,001 compositions have been written about falling in love, or dealing with a breakup, or some kind of emotion. Emotions are extremely powerful, and your audience is likely to resonate with your music if you convincingly write about sadness, jealousy, boredom, loneliness, and these kinds of emotions. We've all felt these at some point in our lives, so can easily identify with what you're trying to express in your emotion. Film music is heavily based on writing emotive music, music that makes the audience feel something, or music that helps tell the audience about the emotion the character is feeling in that scene. And look, let's be honest, emotive writing was pretty much what drew me to film music in the first place. So if you're stuck for an idea, consider basing your next orchestral masterpiece on an emotion. There are hundreds of different emotions us humans can experience and identify with, and some of these emotions are fairly easy to understand and to replicate, such as happiness or sadness or even anger and jealousy. Lots and lots of compositions have been written based on these emotions, but some emotions are a lot more complex. Emotions such as guilt, for example. How on earth would you write guilt? So let's dive into a couple of examples, specific examples of compositions that are based on certain emotions. The Happy Farmer by Franz Schubert is an obvious example of a composition based around that positive, happy emotion. On the other end of the emotional spectrum, Monteverdi wrote a piece called Lamento della Ninfa. It's about a woman who laments her lost love over a slow ground bass. A ground bass is essentially just a repetitive bass line. And then the male voices provide the sad atmospheric backdrop to this composition. Lots of compositions have been written about fiery emotions like anger. Sibelius, Tchaikovsky, and Beethoven all wrote compositions called The Tempest, which means a violent, windy storm, and has often been used as a metaphor for anger or expressing anger in music. Danish composer Jacob Gard wrote a tango about jealousy in 1925. The composer claimed that the mood of the piece had been inspired by a sensational news report he had read about a crime of passion, and jealousy became fixated in his mind, and he just had to write a tango about jealousy. But not all emotions are easy to express or to write music to. As film composers, we're often asked to create music to complex emotional states. I've been asked to compose music that sounds confused, intimidated, critical, hostile, or trusting. Now, how on earth would you write music to these kinds of emotions? We'll learn how to do this later in the course, but for now, your job is to consider choosing an emotion to base your composition around if you feel inspired to do so. Now, if you're stuck for an emotion or you want to explore something more interesting rather than sticking with something like sad or happy, consider having a look at this emotions chart. In the middle, there are 6 easily understood emotions: sad, mad, scared, joyful, and powerful. Oh, and peaceful. These 6 emotions are quite different from each other, and they span out into other related emotions as you get further away from the center. With an emotion such as sadness, for example, no doubt you can already think of a few musical ideas to explore. Perhaps you'd use a minor key or a slow tempo, but as you move further away from this emotion into the lighter blue emotions, let's look at something like guilty, for example. It's still an emotion that elicits sad feelings, so it still has sad as its sort of foundational bottom layer mood, but it's more complex, and you'll have to think about the other layers that go into expressing that emotion of guilt. If you're thinking about going into an emotion that is more complex, you might have to really start thinking about how you can use your music to elicit those kinds of emotions. Now, using the guilt example, for example, instead of just basing your composition on a minor key and a slow tempo, you might have to further expand on this. Perhaps you'll use a heavy, thick texture to represent the heaviness of that feeling of guilt. Or you'll use lots of downward movement in your melodic lines, or maybe even a downward chord progression to represent your descent into guilt. So the more complex the emotion, or the further you move away from those 6 key ones in the middle, the more difficult it's going to become, but also the more challenging, the more exciting, and possibly the more rewarding. So music and emotion is a huge topic, and we won't explore this in super amounts of depth in this course. We will a little bit, but for now, it's important just to realize that basing your composition on an emotion can be a wonderfully powerful place to start your orchestral piece. So have a think about whether this is something you would like to explore further.